Button her up, we need her airborne in 10. Still leaking oil on the port side. Move that fuel truck closer.
In the summer of 1941, before the United States entered the Second World War, a retired American Army Air Corps officer named Claire Chennault was in China, building an air force from scratch. He had 100 P-40 Warhawk fighters, pilots recruited from the American military services under a covert program that the Roosevelt administration was conducting while officially maintaining neutrality. A network of ground observers using telephones and radio to provide early warning of Japanese air attacks, and a tactical doctrine of his own devising that he believed could defeat the Japanese air forces in the Chinese theater even against overwhelming numerical odds. He had almost nothing else. No radar, no spare parts beyond what he could beg or scrounge, no replacement pilots when his men were killed or wounded, no reliable supply line. Everything that reached his units had to come over the hump, the treacherous air route over the Himalayas from India, or by road to the Burma Road before the Japanese closed it. No significant support from Washington, where his patron, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese government, was regarded with a mixture of strategic dependence and personal distrust, and where the specific character of the China theater, distant, logistically impossible, strategically secondary to every other theater, made it consistently the lowest priority for resources and attention. What Chennault had was an idea about how to fight Japanese air power, developed over years of careful observation and unconventional thinking, that the American military establishment had largely rejected, and that the Japanese air forces had not encountered and had not yet developed a counter for. The idea was specific and technical and decisive in its initial application. It was a discovery that the Zero fighter, the dominant Japanese aircraft of the Pacific War's early phase, had specific tactical limitations that a skilled pilot in the right aircraft could exploit. The Zero was faster and more maneuverable than anything the Americans or Chinese had put against it in the early months of the Pacific War. It was also because of the design choices that produced its extraordinary performance, specifically vulnerable. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks, which meant that a bullet that penetrated the tanks produced a catastrophic fire. It had no armor protection for the pilot, and it could not dive at speed without losing control, which meant that an aircraft that could get above it and dive through the engagement could disengage before the Zero could follow. Chennault had identified these vulnerabilities from the combat reports that Chinese pilots had been filing for years, from his own careful observation of Japanese air combat tactics, and from the specific technical analysis of captured Japanese aircraft data that he had assembled. He had developed a tactical system, the hit-and-run tactics, the two-plane element as the basic fighting unit, the prohibition on the kind of turning dogfight that the Zero's superior maneuverability made suicidal, that exploited the Zero's limitations and minimized the disadvantages of the P-40 in comparison to it. He had tried to get Washington to listen to him for years, and Washington had not listened. The American military aviation establishment of the late 1930s and early 1940s had its own ideas about air combat doctrine, and Chennault's ideas did not fit those ideas comfortably. He had retired from the Army Air Corps in 1937 after a series of disputes about doctrine and policy, and had gone to China at the invitation of Chiang Kai-shek's government to advise the Chinese Air Force. The specific path that took him from American military retirement to the command of the most famous air unit of the Pacific War is a story about institutional inflexibility and unconventional thinking that resonates far beyond the specific military context. Before I go further, I want to ask you directly. Subscribe if you haven't already. The next episode is about Admiral Donitz, the man who took 73 U-boats and almost cut Britain off from its supply lines, who came closer to winning the Battle of the Atlantic than any of the Allied commanders wanted to admit. and who ended up as Hitler's successor for a week before surrendering Germany. That story is extraordinary. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss it when it drops. And if the story of the man who fought Japan with 100 planes and no support gives you something, hit the like button. It genuinely matters. Back to Chennault, back to the Flying Tigers and what they actually accomplished and what it actually cost. The specific individuals who flew with the American Volunteer Group, the actual human beings behind the Flying Tigers mythology, represent the human content of the story that the mythology has tended to elevate into symbol at the cost of the specific people. The AVG recruited from the Army Air Corps, the Navy, and the Marine Corps in 1941, drawing pilots and ground crew who were willing to resign their military commissions, join a civilian organization under a cover story, travel to a distant and dangerous theater, and fly in combat for a bonus of $500 per confirmed kill. The mix of motivations that brought these specific men to the AVG included adventure, money, patriotism, frustration with the institutional limitations of their military careers, and a specific character of volunteer service, the willingness to choose the difficult and uncertain over the comfortable and predictable. The most celebrated pilot of the AVG was Robert L. Scott Jr., who later wrote God is My Co-Pilot, one of the most widely read American aviation memoirs of the war. Scott's account of flying in the China theater captured something essential about the specific experience of men who flew with Chennault: the improvisation, the intimacy of the small unit operation, the specific relationship between the pilots and their aircraft and each other that characterized the AVG and the early 14th Air Force. But Scott was one of the exceptional cases, a natural writer who could translate his experience into narrative. The other men of the AVG, the mechanics who kept the aircraft flying with spare parts that had to be improvised when proper parts were unavailable, the pilots who flew the combat missions without the institutional support that military units normally received, the Chinese ground crew who had been trained by the AVG and who were essential to the operation of the bases, have been less fully acknowledged in the mythology than the shark-mouthed P-40 and the confirmed kills. The mechanics deserve particular acknowledgement because they were the essential foundation of everything the AVG accomplished. An aircraft that cannot fly is not a weapon, and keeping P-40s airworthy in the specific conditions of the China theater, extreme temperatures, monsoon humidity, limited spare parts, improvised facilities, required a specific kind of mechanical genius that was as important to the AVG's success as Chennault's tactical doctrine. The men who kept the P-40s flying were not pilots. They were not celebrated in the mythology. They were the reason the pilots could fight. The Chinese ground observers who provided the early warning network were another essential element of the AVG's success that the mythology has consistently underemphasized. Thousands of Chinese volunteers positioned across the vast territory of southwestern China and northern Burma, communicating by telephone and radio with Chennault's operations center, providing the advance warning of Japanese air attacks that allowed the P-40s to be airborne and in position before the Japanese arrived. Without this network, the tactical doctrine could not have been applied. The P-40s would have been scrambling from the ground into the face of Japanese formations rather than diving on them from altitude. These Chinese observers, who served without the military status of the AVG's American personnel, without the bonuses, without the recognition, were performing an essential military function at considerable personal risk. Japanese air attacks on the areas where the observers were positioned were not unusual, and the observers who were identified as providing early warning could face specific retribution from Japanese forces that occupied those areas. Their contribution to the AVG's success was real and significant, and has been less acknowledged than the American pilots who benefited from the warning they provided. The specific human cost of the AVG's operations, the pilots who were killed, the ground crew who were killed in Japanese air attacks on the bases, the Chinese personnel who died in the service of the early warning network, is part of the full accounting of what the Flying Tigers accomplished and what it cost. The mythology of the shark-mouthed P-40 and the confirmed kills does not always acknowledge this cost with the specificity it deserves. The transition of the AVG to the United States Army Air Forces in July 1942, when the United States had been at war for 7 months and the Covert Volunteer Group was regularized into formal military structure, was itself a significant episode that the mythology tends to pass over quickly. The transition was complicated by the fact that most of the AVG's personnel did not want to join the Army Air Forces under conditions being offered. They had been volunteers, operating under a command structure and a compensation arrangement that was different from the regular military, and the specific terms of transition, including the requirement to accept military rank and pay rather than the civilian contract arrangement, were not acceptable to many of them. A significant number of the original AVG members left rather than joining the Army Air Forces. The specific tension between the volunteer character of the AVG and the institutional requirements of the military that was absorbing it was visible in the transition, and it reflected the broader tension between Chennault's approach to building an air force and the institutional military's approach to managing one. The 14th Air Force of the transition created with a more conventionally structured organization than the AVG had been, larger, with more institutional support and more institutional constraints, operating within the broader Army Air Force's command structure rather than as an independent organization reporting directly to Chiang Kai-shek. It was also, because of the resources that eventually arrived over the hump, a more capable force than the AVG had been in its early months. Chennault commanded the 14th Air Force from its formation until July 1945, when he was replaced by General Albert Wiedemeyer, as Stilwell had been replaced by Wiedemeyer a year earlier. He had spent 4 years fighting for resources, fighting with Stilwell, fighting with the Army Air Force's establishment, fighting with the Japanese. And he had built something extraordinary from the 100 planes and the no support that defined the beginning of the story. He was right about the zero. He was right about the tactics. He was partially right about what air power could accomplish in the China theater. And he was wrong enough about the rest, about the ability of air power alone to substitute for ground forces, about the specific promises of what adequate supply would enable, that the China theater strategic results were less than what his promises had implied. The honest assessment of Chennault requires holding both sides, the tactical genius and the strategic overconfidence, the extraordinary achievement with inadequate resources, and the specific failure when the Japanese tested the air power strategy with an infantry offensive, the relationship with China that was genuine and lasting, and the institutional relationship with the American military that was consistently difficult. He flew his own missions when the regulations allowed it, and sometimes when they did not. He designed the tactics that saved Chinese cities from Japanese air attack. He argued with generals and presidents for years and never got the resources he needed. He married a Chinese woman and spent his post-war years in Asia. That is the Chennault War, the 100 planes and no support, the shark-mouthed P-40s and the early warning network, the tactics that worked and the strategy that was tested and found partially wanting. The man who was right about the specific things he had directly observed and who extrapolated beyond them into promises that the operational reality could not fully redeem. That is the full accounting, the broader context of the China theater in the Second World War, the strategic importance and the specific institutional neglect that characterized the Allied approach to China, provides a framework within which Chennault's specific achievements need to be understood. China had been at war with Japan since 1937, when the Marco Polo Bridge incident had escalated into the full-scale Japanese invasion that would cost tens of millions of Chinese lives over the following 8 years. The specific brutality of the Japanese campaign in China, the Nanjing Massacre of 1937-38, the chemical weapons attacks, the systematic destruction of Chinese cities, and the deliberate killing of civilian populations, was one of the most catastrophic episodes of the entire Second World War period. And it was occurring before the Western Allies had entered the conflict and before the specific events that would bring America into the war at Pearl Harbor. The Chinese nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek had been fighting this war with inadequate resources against a Japanese military machine that was technologically and organizationally superior. The Chinese Air Force had been destroyed as an effective combat force. The Chinese Army, though enormous in numbers, was poorly equipped, poorly led at many levels, and struggling to maintain itself in the face of Japanese pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. In this context, Chennault's arrival in China in 1937 as a military advisor was not simply the beginning of an aviation career in an exotic location. It was the beginning of a sustained commitment to a country and a cause that would define the remainder of his professional life. He spent 4 years in China before the AVG was formed, learning the country, the language, the specific character of the Chinese military situation, and developing the early warning network and the tactical doctrine that the AVG would eventually apply. the specific relationship between Chennault and the Chinese nationalist leadership, and particularly his relationship with Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang, was one of the defining features of the China theater and one of the most important factors in the specific political disputes that characterized the theater's management. Chiang trusted Chennault in ways that he did not trust most American military personnel, partly because of their specific relationship and partly because Chennault's approach, air power as a primary instrument, required less of the Chinese ground forces and more of the American resources. This specific alignment of interest between Chennault and the Chinese nationalist leadership was one of the sources of the Stilwell conflict. Stilwell believed that the Chinese ground forces needed to be reformed and retrained and committed to aggressive combat against the Japanese, and that Chiang was using the air power argument as a way to avoid the politically risky commitment of his forces to serious ground combat. Chennault believed that Stilwell's insistence on ground operations was misguided and was consuming resources that could be better used by the air forces. Both men had real points. Stilwell's assessment of the Chinese army's need for reform was accurate. The Chinese ground forces were poorly led at the senior levels and were consistently unable to achieve the kind of sustained offensive operations that would have required the Japanese to divert resources from other theaters. Chennault's assessment of what air power could accomplish against Japanese logistics was also partially accurate. The 14th Air Force did impose real costs on Japanese operations in China. The specific allocation question, how much of the hump tonnage should go to air power and how much to ground forces, was a genuinely difficult strategic question that the Roosevelt administration resolved, largely in Chennault's favor, with results that were mixed. The Ichi-Go offensive of 1944 was a Japanese response to the 14th Air Force's growing effectiveness. The specific Japanese decision to use ground forces to destroy the air bases that the air forces were operating from. The offensive demonstrated that the Chinese ground forces were not capable of defending the airfields and that the allocation of hump tonnage to air power at the expense of building Chinese ground force capability had left a critical vulnerability. The fall of the eastern airfields was a significant strategic setback for the China theater, and it was a specific event that most clearly vindicated Stilwell's concern about ground force capability. It was also, from the Japanese perspective, a costly operation that consumed resources and manpower that Japan could not easily replace, and that did not ultimately resolve the strategic situation in China in Japan's favor. The broader strategic question, whether more resources allocated to the China theater would have made a decisive difference to the Pacific War's outcome, is one that the military historians have generally assessed negatively. The specific constraints of the hump route limited what was achievable in the theater regardless of how the available tonnage was allocated. The Chinese nationalist government's political situation, the concurrent conflict with the Chinese communists, the specific character of Chiang Kai-shek's leadership, limited what could be accomplished with the resources that were provided. The China theater was, in the overall Pacific War strategy, a secondary theater that occupied Japanese forces that would otherwise have been available elsewhere, and this strategic value was achieved regardless of whether Chennault's specific air power strategy or Stilwell's ground force reform strategy was the right approach. The Flying Tigers themselves, the specific pilots and ground crew who flew and maintained the P-40s over China in 1941 and 1942, represent one of the more extraordinary individual stories of the early Pacific War. They were volunteers recruited from the American military services through a covert government program, who were technically civilians under a cover story about agricultural equipment, who were paid bonuses for confirmed kills, and who flew in conditions that the standard military supply system would have found challenging to support. The specific character of these men, young Americans who had volunteered for a dangerous assignment in a distant theater before their country was at war, who maintained their aircraft with spare parts begged and scrounged from wherever they could be found, who flew combat missions without the institutional support that military units normally receive, was genuinely extraordinary. The specific culture of the AVG, informal, independent, deeply focused on the practical business of keeping aircraft in the air and defeating the Japanese, was itself a product of the conditions under which it operated. They were not all heroes in the simple sense. The AVG had disciplinary problems, had pilots who refused combat missions, had internal conflicts that the informal command structure did not always resolve well. The mythology of the Flying Tigers has smoothed these rougher edges in a way that myths generally smooth the rougher edges of the experiences they commemorate. The full story includes the disciplinary problems and the refusals alongside the courage and the extraordinary tactical achievements. The specific legacy of the Flying Tigers in Chinese national memory is one of the more interesting dimensions of the Chennault story. In China, both the mainland People's Republic and in Taiwan, the Flying Tigers are remembered with a specific warmth and gratitude that reflects a specific role they played in defending Chinese territory when no one else was defending it. The Flying Tigers Memorial Hall in Zhejiang, the city in Hunan province where the AVG was based in its later period, is one of the most visited Second World War museums in China. The specific visual iconography of the shark-mouthed P-40 has become one of the enduring symbols of the Sino-American cooperation of the Second World War era. This Chinese memory of the Flying Tigers has a political dimension that the post-war separation of the Chinese nationalist government to Taiwan and the establishment of the People's Republic have complicated in specific ways. The Flying Tigers served the nationalist government. They were, in the specific institutional sense, instruments of Chiang Kai-shek's war effort. The People's Republic of China, which fought the nationalist government in the Civil War that followed the Second World War, and which is a successor state to the China that the Flying Tigers defended, has navigated this complexity by emphasizing the anti-Japanese character of the Flying Tigers service rather than its specifically nationalist character. Chennault himself died in 1958, before the specific political complications of his legacy became as fully developed as they subsequently became. He died having spent his post-war years in a region running civil air transport, the airline that eventually became Air America, in the China-Taiwan Southeast Asia theater, maintaining his connection to the part of the world where he had made his most significant contributions. He had never fully reconciled with the American military establishment, which had passed him over for promotion in ways that reflected the specific institutional resentments that his unconventional career had generated. He was promoted to Lieutenant General, 3 stars, shortly before his death, in a posthumous recognition that the military had not provided during his active career. The promotion was appropriate to his achievement. The tardiness was appropriate to the institutional relationship. He built an air force from 100 planes and no support. He defeated Japanese air power in the specific conditions of the China theater. He overpromised what air power alone could deliver and paid the cost of that overpromising when the Japanese tested on the ground. He spent years fighting for resources from Washington and never got enough. He married a Chinese woman and spent his post-war years in Asia and died at 64 lung cancer. Having never fully reconciled with the institution, he had spent his career challenging the shark-mouthed P-40s, the early warning network, the hit and run tactics, the 100 planes and no support, the extraordinary achievement and the specific limitations. The man who was right about the zero and right about the tactics, and overly confident about what the tactics could accomplish without adequate ground force support. That is the Chennault War. That is the full accounting of what the Flying Tigers were and what they accomplished and what it cost them and the people they were defending. The specific tactical innovation that Chennault brought to the China theater, the system of fighter combat that he had developed through years of observation and analysis, deserves examination in some detail, because it was a foundation of everything the Flying Tigers accomplished, and because it represents one of the more significant tactical intellectual achievements of the early Pacific War. The Zero fighter had first appeared in combat over China in 1940, and its impact on the Chinese Air Force had been devastating. The Zero's speed and maneuverability were so superior to anything the Chinese had that Chinese pilots were being killed in the turning dogfights that conventional fighter combat required, and the Chinese Air Force was effectively destroyed as an offensive force. The Japanese Zero pilots flew with a confidence born of experience and what appeared to be an absolute technical superiority over everything they were likely to face. Chennault had been in China during this period, and he had been watching and analyzing the combat reports with a specific attention to tactical detail that characterized his professional thinking. He was looking for the vulnerabilities, the specific weaknesses in the Zero's design and in the Japanese pilot's tactical approach that a more limited aircraft with trained pilots could exploit. He found several. The Zero's extraordinary maneuverability came at a cost in structural strength. The aircraft was lightly built, and diving at high speed put stresses on the airframe that the design could not fully sustain. A P-40, which was not maneuverable enough to turn with the Zero, could outdive it, could push over into a steep dive and reach speeds that the Zero could not safely follow. If the P-40 pilot used a dive to disengage from a fight that was going badly, the Zero could not pursue. The Zero also lacked the self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor that American aircraft were equipped with, the specific design choices that had allowed the Japanese designers to save weight and achieve the extraordinary performance characteristics. This meant that a Zero that was hit by gunfire was significantly more vulnerable than an American aircraft in the same situation. A burst that would be absorbed by AP-40 self-sealing tanks could turn a Zero into a fireball. And the Japanese tactical approach, which assumed air superiority and which had been developed against opponents who were outmatched, had specific patterns that an alert opponent could anticipate and exploit. The Japanese pilots tended to fight in specific formations and to use specific approaches that Chennault had identified and that his training system was designed to counter. The specific tactical system Chennault developed and drilled into his pilots was built around these observations, 2 plane elements rather than 3, so that the wingman could cover the leader without being left behind. Altitude advantage maintained at all costs, so that the P-40 pilots were always diving into the engagement rather than climbing to meet the Zero on terms that favored the Zero. No turning dogfights under any circumstances. If the P-40 was caught in a turning fight with a Zero, the P-40 pilot was to dive and disengage immediately. Hit and run, always, exploiting the speed advantage in the dive and the firepower advantage in the guns. The system required discipline that was contrary to the natural instincts of fighter pilots, who were generally inclined toward the aggressive individual dogfight rather than controlled tactical system. Chennault's training was designed to overcome these instincts, to produce pilots who would follow the tactical doctrine even when their natural instincts were telling them to turn and fight. The success of the Flying Tigers in their first month of operation was largely attributable to the quality of this training and to the specific correctness of the tactical doctrine. The early warning network that Chennault had built was the other essential element of the system. The Chinese ground observers, thousands of volunteers positioned across southern China and Burma, communicating by telephone and radio, provided advance warning of Japanese air attacks that allowed Chennault's fighters to be airborne and in position with altitude advantage before the Japanese arrived. Without this network, the tactical doctrine could not be applied. Pilots who were scrambling from the ground as the Japanese arrived were in no position to achieve the altitude advantage that the doctrine required. The specific combination of tactical doctrine and early warning, the system that Chennault had spent years developing and that Washington had spent years ignoring, was what made the Flying Tigers possible, and it was what made the initial results so dramatic. Japanese formations that had been routing Chinese air forces were encountering P-40s that were already in position above them, that dove the formation, fired, and dove away before the Zeros could respond, and that refused to be drawn into the turning fights that Japanese air combat doctrine assumed. The specific kill ratios that the American Volunteer Group achieved in its first months of operation, December 1941 through July 1942, were extraordinary and have been the subject of most scholarly scrutiny in the Flying Tiger story. The AVG's official claims were of 297 Japanese aircraft destroyed against the loss of 14 pilots in air combat. The Japanese records, examined after the war, suggest a lower number of Japanese aircraft actually lost, approximately 115 to 130, depending on how the analysis is conducted. The discrepancy between the claimed and confirmed kills reflects the same inflation that characterized air combat claims in every theater of the war. The chaos of the combat environment made accurate assessment of kills genuinely difficult, and the institutional incentives for claiming kills were always stronger than the incentives for accuracy. The scholarly revision does not change the essential achievement. The Flying Tigers, with limited resources and in a theater that was receiving the lowest priority of any Allied theater, conducted an effective air defense of the remaining Chinese territory and supply lines that would not otherwise have been defended. They imposed a cost on Japanese air operations in the theater that was disproportionate to the resources deployed against them, and they demonstrated in the specific operational environment of the China theater that Chennault's tactical doctrine was sound, that trained pilots applying the right tactics could defeat Japanese air forces that were numerically superior. The institutional journey that brought Chennault and his ideas to China is itself an instructive story about how military establishments relate to unconventional thinking. Chennault had been developing his ideas about fighter aviation and its tactical application since the early 1930s and had been finding his ideas unwelcome in the Army Air Corps since approximately the same period. The specific institutional conflict was not simply about tactics. It was about the fundamental concept of what air power was for, and Chennault's fighter-centric view was in direct conflict with the bomber-centric view that was becoming the dominant American air power doctrine. The bomber advocates believed, and would spend the Second World War attempting to demonstrate, that strategic bombing of industrial and military targets could by itself compel an enemy to surrender or could so devastate an enemy's war-making capacity as to make ground combat unnecessary or decisive. Chennault believed that fighter aviation, used aggressively and with tactical intelligence, was an equally important component of air power and could produce decisive results in the right operational context. The subsequent history of the Second World War suggested that both views had merit in specific contexts. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany produced significant industrial damage, but did not by itself compel surrender. The fighter aviation that Chennault pioneered in the China theater produced effective tactical results, but could not substitute for ground forces in the defense of the airfields it was operating from. The truth was somewhere between the two doctrinal positions, and the specific war in the specific theaters of the Second World War was the laboratory in which the truth was being worked out at enormous human cost. Chennault arrived at a specific position in that argument through the specific path of the China theater, an experience that gave him insights that the bomber advocates in Washington and the Pacific commanders in Hawaii did not have, because they were not watching the Zero fight in the specific conditions of the China theater where he had been watching it. His insights were specific to his experience, and they were correct in the specific context from which they derived. The broader argument, the claim that air power with adequate supply could substitute for ground forces in holding China, went beyond what a specific experience supported, and the Ichi-Go offensive was a specific event that demonstrated the limits of the broader argument. He had been right about the tactics. He had been overly optimistic about the strategic implications. This is a specific character of his achievement and his failure. The tactical insight was real and important and proved itself in combat. The strategic promise exceeded what the tactical reality could deliver when tested against a competent ground offensive. The institution he was arguing with, Washington, Stilwell, the Army Air Force's establishment, had been wrong to resist his tactical insights. It had been not entirely wrong to be skeptical of his strategic claims. The Chennault War was, in the end, the war of a man who was right about the specific things he had directly observed and analyzed, and who extrapolated beyond those specific things in ways that the full operational context did not support. He was the Flying Tigers. He was also the man whose promises of what air power could do in China were not fully redeemed when the Japanese chose to test him on the ground. Both are part of the story. Both deserve acknowledgement. Both are the Chennault War. Claire Chennault was born in Commerce, Texas, in 1893, and had grown up with a specific character of the American South. Direct, stubborn, deeply confident in his own judgment, and not naturally inclined to defer to institutional authority when the institutional authorities seemed to him to be wrong. He had flown in the First World War, had become one of the most skilled aerobatic pilots in the Army Air Corps, and had developed during the 1930s a specific interest in fighter aviation and fighter tactics that put him in conflict with the prevailing Army Air Corps doctrine, which was heavily oriented towards strategic bombing, and which regarded fighter aviation as inherently defensive and secondarily important. The specific conflict with Army Air Corps doctrine was not simply about tactics. It was about the fundamental concept of what air power was for and how it should be used. The strategic bombing advocates, who would eventually become the architects of the American bomber campaign against Germany and Japan, believed that air power's primary value was in long-range attack against industrial and military targets, and that fighters existed primarily to escort bombers and protect airfields. Chennault believed that fighter aviation, properly applied, was an offensive weapon of the first order, that a well-trained and intelligently led fighter force could dominate a theater of operations and could be a decisive element in the outcome of a war. He was right, in the specific sense that his tactical system worked when applied against the Japanese air forces in the China theater. The American Volunteer Group, the Flying Tigers as they became known, achieved a kill ratio against the Japanese air forces in the first months of their operation that was extraordinary by any standard. The specific combination of Chennault's tactical doctrine, the early warning network he had built from Chinese ground observers, and the specific qualities of the pilots he had recruited produced an air unit that consistently defeated Japanese forces that were numerically larger and in some respects technically superior. The kill ratio claims of the Flying Tigers have been contested by subsequent historical scholarship, which has found the original claims to be somewhat inflated when checked against Japanese combat records. But the scholarly revision does not change the essential character of what the Flying Tigers accomplished. They defended the Burma Road and the airfields of southern China against Japanese air attacks that, without their presence, would have gone largely unopposed, and they did so with a resource allocation that was a fraction of what any theater commander in any other part of the war was receiving. The specific logistical situation of the China theater was one of the most extreme of any Allied theater of the war. Everything that reached Chennault's forces had to come over the hump. The air route over the Himalayas from Assam in India to Yunnan in China through some of the most dangerous flying conditions in the world. The hump route crossed mountains that reached above 20,000 feet, frequently under monsoon weather conditions, without reliable weather forecasting, with aircraft that were at or beyond their operational limits. The pilots who flew the hump route, the cargo crews of the Air Transport Command, lost an aircraft and crew approximately every 1,000 tons of supplies delivered, a casualty rate that was among the highest of any aviation operation of the war. The supplies that arrived over the hump were divided between the needs of the Chinese nationalist forces, which were enormous, as the forces were fighting the Japanese and the Chinese communists simultaneously, and the needs of the 14th Air Force that Chennault eventually commanded. The allocation was contested between Chennault and General Joseph Stilwell, the American theater commander in China, Burma, and India, in one of the most bitter interallied disputes of the entire war. The Chennault-Stilwell dispute is one of the defining episodes of the China theater, and it deserves examination because it illuminates both the specific character of what Chennault was trying to accomplish and the specific institutional and political constraints within which he was operating. Stilwell, who will have his own episode in this series, was a ground combat officer of the old school, deeply skeptical of air power's ability to substitute for ground forces, and deeply suspicious of Chiang Kai-shek's commitment to actually fighting the Japanese rather than conserving his forces for the eventual showdown with the communists. Stilwell wanted the hump tonnage allocated to building and supplying the Chinese army for a ground offensive in Burma. Chennault wanted the hump tonnage allocated to the 14th Air Force for an air offensive against Japanese supply lines and shipping in the South China Sea. He believed and argued consistently and forcefully to Roosevelt directly that a sustained air campaign with adequate supply could disrupt Japanese operations in China sufficiently to tie down Japanese forces that would otherwise be available for operations elsewhere in the Pacific. Roosevelt was sympathetic to Chennault's argument, partly because Chiang Kai-shek preferred Chennault's approach. It required less of the Chinese ground forces and more of the American air forces, and partly because Chennault's confident and specific promises of what his air forces could accomplish with adequate supply were more appealing than Stilwell's grimmer assessment of what a ground campaign in Burma would require. Roosevelt gave Chennault his airplanes. The 14th Air Force was built up through 1943 and 1944 into a substantial force, and the result was the air offensive that Chennault had promised. The air offensive achieved real results. The 14th Air Force interdicted Japanese supply lines, attacked Japanese shipping, and provided air support to Chinese ground forces in ways that disrupted Japanese operations in China and imposed costs on Japanese logistics throughout the theater. The specific destruction of Japanese shipping by the 14th Air Force contributed to the broader strategic strangulation of Japan's supply lines that the submarine campaign was simultaneously pursuing. But Chennault's promises had been too specific and too confident. He had told Roosevelt that with adequate supply, 500 tons per month, then later increased demands, he could defeat the Japanese in China. The supply was provided, and the Japanese were not defeated. Instead, in the spring and summer of 1944, the Japanese launched Operation Ichi-Go, a massive ground offensive that overran the Chinese forces defending the 14th Air Force's airfields and drove Chennault's air units from the bases they had been operating from in eastern China. Ichi-Go was a specific military event that most comprehensively refuted Chennault's argument that air power could substitute for ground forces in the China theater. The Japanese ground offensive, which was designed specifically to destroy the 14th Air Force's bases, demonstrated exactly what Stilwell had been arguing. that air bases without adequate ground force protection were inherently vulnerable, and that the allocation of hump tonnage to air power rather than to the Chinese army had left the Chinese forces too weak to defend the positions that the air forces required. The Ichi-Go offensive was a strategic catastrophe for the China theater. The Chinese forces were routed. The airfields were lost. Chennault's forces had to withdraw and rebuild from new bases further west. The specific strategic architecture that Chennault had promised could hold China together was revealed as dependent on Chinese ground forces that had not received the resources he had advocated diverting to air power. Chennault's response to Ichi-Go was characteristic. He blamed Stilwell, he blamed the hump tonnage allocation, he blamed the failure to build adequate Chinese ground forces, and he argued that if he had received even more air power and more supply, the outcome would have been different. The arguments were not without some validity. The allocation of hump tonnage was a genuinely contested strategic question, and there is no definitive answer to what a different allocation would have produced. But the specific promises that Chennault had made, the specific confident predictions of what air power could accomplish, were not redeemed by the events of 1944. Stilwell was relieved of his command in October 1944, partly as a result of the accumulated tensions of the China theater, and partly because Chiang Kai-shek demanded his removal. Chennault remained in command of the 14th Air Force until the war's end, continuing to fly operations against the Japanese in China and building his air force into a more substantial force than it had ever been in the years when he had been arguing for resources. His relationship with the Chinese, with Chiang Kai-shek, and with the Chinese people who had watched the Flying Tigers defend their skies when no one else was doing so, was genuinely warm and genuinely mutual. He had spent years in China before the war, had learned the language, had developed relationships with Chinese officers and officials that went beyond the professional, and had come to care about the country and the people in ways that were not characteristic of every American officer who served in the China theater. The Chinese honored him in ways that reflected this specific relationship. The Flying Tigers were celebrated in Chinese popular culture in a way that had persisted to the present day. He married a Chinese-American journalist, Anna Chan, in 1947, and spent the post-war years continuing his connection to China through various aviation enterprises in the region. He was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1957 and died in July 1958 at the age of 64. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, having been recalled to active duty to receive a posthumous promotion to lieutenant general shortly before his death. The Chennault story is, at its heart, a story about the specific tension between institutional authority and unconventional insight, between the established doctrine of a military institution and the specific insights that challenge that doctrine, that are resisted by the institution, and that are eventually proven correct in specific ways and wrong in others. Chennault was right about the Zero's vulnerabilities and right about the tactical doctrine that exploited them. He was partly right about what air power could accomplish in China. He was partly wrong about what it could accomplish without adequate ground force support. The Flying Tigers are remembered with an affection and a mythological aura that reflects both what they accomplished and what they represented. The small force doing the impossible, the independent spirit of the American volunteer fighting against a larger and better supplied enemy, the specific human story of pilots and mechanics doing extraordinary things with inadequate resources. These elements of the story are real. They are also simplified. The full story includes the political disputes, the inflated kill claims, the specific failures of the air power strategy in the face of the Ichi-Go offensive, and the specific costs paid by the Chinese people who endured the Japanese occupation of the areas that the 14th Air Force could not defend. The full story requires holding the achievements and the failures in the same frame, and acknowledging that the unconventional genius who built something extraordinary from almost nothing was also the man whose strategic promises exceeded what air power alone could deliver. He flew P-40s over China when China had nothing else. He trained pilots and built bases and designed tactics and argued with generals and presidents and prevailed against the Japanese often enough to matter. And when the Japanese threw a ground offensive at his bases, the air power that was supposed to be enough was not enough, and the promise that sounded so compelling to Roosevelt in the White House turned out to be more complicated than the man who made it had fully understood. That is the Chennault War, the 100 planes and no support, the extraordinary achievement, and the specific limitations that the extraordinary achievement ran into when the Japanese chose to test it with infantry. He was right about the Zero. He was right about the tactics. He was partly right about what air power could do. And the party was wrong about cost the China theater the eastern airfields and cost the Chinese people the specific protection they had been promised. That is the full accounting. That is the Chennault War. The specific question of how Chennault should be remembered as the aviation genius who built something extraordinary from almost nothing, or as a strategic overconfident who overpromised what air power could deliver, is one that the historical scholarship has engaged in ways that resist a simple answer in either direction. The mythology of the Flying Tigers, established during the war itself by the specific publicity apparatus that the Roosevelt administration and the Chinese nationalist government both had reasons to promote, created an image of Chennault as an unqualified hero. The maverick genius who was right when the institution was wrong, who defeated the Japanese with 100 planes when conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done. This image has a foundation in reality. The AVG did defeat Japanese air forces in specific engagements in ways that the conventional military wisdom would not have predicted. Chennault's tactical doctrine was correct. His insights into the Zero's vulnerabilities were accurate, but the mythology also simplified and elevated in ways that obscured the more complex truth. The kill ratio claims were inflated. The strategic promises were excessive. The Ichi-Go offensive demonstrated real limitations in what the air power strategy could accomplish without adequate ground force support. The institutional relationship with Stilwell, whatever the specific merits of their specific disputes, produced a theater command that was less effective than it could have been if the two men had been capable of working together. The honest assessment acknowledges both dimensions, the genuine achievement and the genuine failure, the tactical insight and the strategic overconfidence, without allowing either to disappear into the narrative that serves mythology. The specific pilots who flew with the Flying Tigers, the actual men in the actual aircraft over the actual Chinese landscape, deserve to be known as the specific human beings they were, not as the abstracted symbol of the shark-mouthed P-40 that the mythology has made them. They were young Americans who volunteered for a dangerous assignment in a distant theater, who flew with courage and skill, who died in combat and in accidents and from disease in the specific conditions of the China theater. They were also, like all human beings in extreme circumstances, capable of fear and failure, and the specific compromises that survival in difficult conditions requires. The Chinese people who were defended by the Flying Tigers, who watched the shark-mouthed P-40s take off in the mountain airfields and return with the reports of Japanese aircraft destroyed, were the specific people whose protection was the point of the operation. Their experience of the war, the Japanese occupation, the bombing, the specific brutality of the Japanese campaign in China, provides a human context in which the Flying Tigers' achievement needs to be understood. They were not defending an abstraction. They were defending specific people in specific places who were experiencing specific things. Chennault understood this. His connection to China was personal as well as professional, and his identification with the Chinese people's struggle against Japanese aggression was genuine in a way that was not always characteristic of American officers in the theater. This genuine identification was part of what made him effective as a theater commander and part of what made his specific approach. Building the Air Force from scratch, working with the Chinese on the early warning network, understanding the China theater as something more than a sideshow, distinctively valuable. He died in 1958, too early to see the full post-war development of the China theater's complicated legacy. The People's Republic of China, which replaced the nationalist government that it served, honored the Flying Tigers in ways that the political context made complicated. The anti-Japanese aspect of the service could be honored without fully acknowledging the nationalist dimension of what the Flying Tigers had represented. The Taiwan government, the successor to the nationalist government, honored him more straightforwardly as a hero of the republic he had served. His widow, Anna Chennault, who survived him by decades and became a figure in American politics and in the China lobby that sought to influence American policy toward the Chinese nationalist government, maintain his memory and his legacy in the specific political context of Cold War American-China relations. The specific relationship between the Chennault legacy and the American political position on Taiwan and China is part of the post-war story that the mythology of the Flying Tigers does not always fully engage with. What endures from the Chennault story? What the specific historical assessment preserves alongside the complexity is a specific achievement of the American Volunteer Group in the months between December 1941 and July 1942. The defense of the Burma Road, the protection of the Chinese cities from Japanese air attack, the demonstration that a well-trained and intelligently led fighter force could defeat a numerically and technically superior opponent in the specific conditions of a China theater. That achievement was real. It was built on tactical insight that the institution had refused to hear. It was accomplished with resources that were inadequate to the full strategic task. It was defended long enough to matter. 100 planes. No support. The shark-mouth P-40s over the Chinese mountains. The early warning network of Chinese volunteers. The hit-and-run tactics that the Zero could not match. The kills that were claimed and the kills that were confirmed, and the difference between them. The pilots who came home and the pilots who did not. That is the Flying Tigers. That is the Chennault War. The specific comparison between Chennault and the other theater commanders of the Pacific War, MacArthur, Nimitz, Slim, illuminates what was distinctive about his approach and what was shared across a range of commanders who fought the Pacific War with different resources in different contexts. MacArthur and Chennault shared a specific quality of institutional conflict. Both were commanders who believed their judgment was superior to the institutional framework that constrained them, who lobbied persistently for the resources they believed their theaters required, and who achieved their most significant results when they were given enough institutional support to demonstrate what their specific approaches could accomplish. Both also overextended their promises of what their approach could accomplish, and both paid specific institutional and reputational costs when the gap between promise and achievement became visible. Slim and Chennault shared a specific challenge: building effective fighting forces from inadequate resources in theaters that received the lowest institutional priority. Both demonstrated that institutional neglect, while genuinely damaging to operational effectiveness, does not necessarily prevent the achievement of extraordinary results by commanders of sufficient talent and commitment. Both rebuild from disaster. Both achieve results that exceeded what the resource allocation they received would have suggested was possible. The specific difference is in the strategic honesty that characterized their approaches. Slim was notably careful about not overpromising what his forces could accomplish with the resources available. His operational planning for Imphal Kohima and for the subsequent Burma campaign was built on an accurate assessment of what was achievable given the actual resources, and the results matched the assessment. Chennault's promises of Roosevelt exceeded what was achievable, and the results, while real, fell short of the promise. This specific difference in strategic honesty between the commander who calibrates his promises to the achievable and the commander whose confidence in his approach leads him to overpromise is one of the most instructive contrasts in the Pacific War's command performance. Both Slim and Chennault were commanders of genuine talent. Slim's talent included the specific quality of calibrating his promises to his actual assessment of the situation. Chennault's talent included the specific quality of tactical insight, but not the same degree of strategic restraint. The Flying Tigers, the specific men and the specific aircraft and the specific operations, remain one of the most compelling stories of the early Pacific War, and the mythological resonance of the shark-mouth P-40 reflects something genuine about what the AVG accomplished. They were real. The achievement was real. The specific human beings who flew the missions and kept the aircraft flying were extraordinary in the ways that the mythology suggests. The fuller story, the tactics that were right and the strategy that was overpromised, the kill claims that were inflated, and the achievements that were real, the man who was right about the Zero and wrong about what defeating the Zero could substitute for, is more complicated than mythology and more accurate than the myth. He built an air force from 100 planes and no support. He defeated the Japanese in specific engagements with tactics that the conventional wisdom said could not work. He overpromised what air power could deliver in the China theater. He spent years fighting for resources and never got enough. He understood China in ways that few American officers matched. He died at 64, having been promoted to lieutenant general in the last weeks of his life, having spent his post-war years in Asia, having married a Chinese woman, and built a post-war aviation career in a region that he had spent the war defending. 100 planes. No support from Washington. The Flying Tigers over China. The shark-mouth P-40 that became one of the enduring images of the Pacific War. the early warning network of Chinese volunteers. The tactics that worked against the Zero, that is the Chennault War, that is what it was and what it cost and what it accomplished and where it fell short. The full accounting requires all of it